Amateurs talk about product. Professionals study org charts. I'm joined today by Mac Dougherty. Welcome, Mac.
Thank you for the warm welcome, and it's wonderful to be here. I've been looking forward to chatting with you about this, and hopefully your listeners will enjoy hearing about org charts from myself and from my study of folks like Melvin Conway and others.
Absolutely. So you're an experienced entrepreneur. You also dabble in some SaaS investments and lots of go-to-market expertise. And you've had this amazing blog post which captured my attention on Reddit, and not just me. I think hundreds of others got some gold badges. Right, about amateurs who really focus about product versus professionals who study org charts. So tell me a little bit about your blog post. How did you come about to write this, and what's the background?
Sure. Well, thank you for first your kind words about it. Thanks for reading it, and thanks to everybody who interacted with it, both on Reddit and also on my blog, macdougherty.com. So I've been thinking about these kinds of issues for a long time. As you mentioned, I've been in the startup game for a while. I've founded a number of companies over the past 20 years, mostly in the SaaS space. More recently, have been doing some work on the investment side as well. And, one of the things that I have noticed in my career is that the structure of your organization has really profound effects. And we often look at it, you think, okay, what is the purpose of the structure of your organization? You say, well, maybe it's productivity, maybe it's better communication. It's often hazily defined. And in my experience, and most of my experiences dealing with startups start out without a lot of organization, or they tend to be very flat, and then they sort of accrue organization over time, often because they hit scaling challenges. As they grow, they need to put in some organizational structure in order to keep scaling. And that's perfectly reasonable, and a perfectly reasonable way to think about it. But it's also true that the way you organize your company has profound effects on how you build product. And often I think that part of the impact of how you structure your organization is lost, because organizations are often responding to needs of sort of internal scaling challenges, and sometimes lose sight of the impact of how your organizational structuring choices will affect your product. And so I wanted to write this blog post to speak to some of these issues, to try and put them in the forefront of people's minds, because I do think sometimes people are either lose sight of them, or maybe because the pain of the scaling challenges is so acute, that dominates their thinking about these issues. But really, I think you have to take a broader view.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the origination of all of this, which started with Conways Law, that every product manager in software quotes. Can you tell us a little bit what Conway's Law is? Who was Conway? And is this still a relevant law, still playing out in currently?
Sure. So as many people know, Conway's Law says essentially that the structure of a software application will reflect the communication structure of the organization that created it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to unpack in that statement, and so I want to, and we will, I'm sure. Let me put a pin in unpacking it, and first say that Melvin Conway is a computer scientist. He did some foundational work on, among other things, compilers in the 1950s. Was involved with building out different sorts of programming languages when he was affiliated with Massachusetts General Hospital. He has been doing work on graphical user interfaces. I mean, he has touched many of the most important areas of computer science, and has been doing it for quite a while. Was doing, I think it's safe to say, computer science before it was cool.
Totally.
I'm not sure when computer science became cool, but I am confident that like the 1950s is like prior to that point.
Definitely.
And a lot of the folks who were engaged in computer science and computer engineering at that time, I think, thought very deeply about computer engineering as a human discipline, that thinking about the people involved is just as important as thinking about the machines. And some disciplines, you see that very straightforwardly, like human computer interface design, for example. But there's more to it than that. So, some of the work of this type is like the Mythical Man Month, which is a book that if folks are not familiar with, I recommend looking at that because it speaks to some similar issues around how do you accurately forecast when a software project is going to be completed.
Yeah.
And so,
which is always later than expected.
Oh, right, exactly. There's no good news to be found in Mythical Man Month, unfortunately. So Conway is one of these folks who are thinking deeply, not just about code, not just about machines, but about the people involved in producing software and how the people and the machines and the code interact. And so, I try to be a student of history, and I think Conway's work is well worth studying in that context. And it absolutely has important implications today, particularly since over the past couple of years with the pandemic, organizations have changed their internal communication structures as they've moved increasingly virtual.
Yeah.
And so I think we have seen how relevant Conway's Law is, right? In almost in real time, that the way organizations build software has changed to some degree, and one of the reasons for that is because their internal communication structures have changed as they have gone virtual.
Right. So I'm trying to think of how we apply Conway's Law into like a company that we all know. So if I want to be building an Apple, right? I want to be building the new iPhone 17 versus some kind of very corporate-y enterprise, IBM like product. So does that mean that the teams that I put together and how they communicate are very different?
I think yes. If you're being intentional about it, you want to structure the teams quite a bit differently. And I encourage everybody to be quite intentional about it. Then the flip side is, if you're not intentional about it, you may encounter headwinds that you weren't anticipating and that may be kind of puzzling. So to take an example, in the blog post, I point to AWS as being an example of of a product that was almost an emergent property of the organizational choices that Amazon made. So Amazon made a couple of key organizational structuring decisions early in its career. One of those, and this applies most accurately, I think, to the technology organization at Amazon. Like the fulfillment organization, I think, runs differently. I'm focused specifically on the tech piece of Amazon.
Yeah.
So one of the rules that they tried to stick to was that any initiative should be built by teams that could be fed by no more than 2 pizzas, right? The 2 pizza rule.
Yeah.
So you have, a team of, it depends on how hungry you are, but it's, on the order of a half dozen, 8 maybe people or so. Yeah. That rule has a couple of implications. One of the things that's implied by that is everybody's familiar with the status meeting, right? Perhaps the dreaded status meeting. If every organization in your company is comprised of no more than 6 or 8 people, as you scale, if all the organizations have to be aware, all these little two pizza teams have to be aware of what all the other 2 pizza teams are doing in order to get anything done. Like if everybody has to understand the status of all the other teams, very quickly you'll be doing nothing but having status meetings.
Yep.
Right. This 2 pizza team doesn't scale using status meetings, and Amazon doesn't do status meetings. Amazon has a bunch of practices where they avoid that. But one of those practices that they implemented is they said, look, every piece of technology that we build, and this was again very early, this was pre-AWS, every piece of technology that we build is going to be available as a service. And I believe I wasn't there at the time, but I believe that the reason for that they had to do that in order to stick to the two pizza team. Because only if you structure whatever it is you're building with a two-person team as a service, that means you publish its interfaces.
Yeah. And
if you publish the interfaces, now all of a sudden you don't need status meetings. Whatever you need, you can look up in a directory of services, which is itself a two-person team organized thing. Read the service documentation, and now you know how to interact with it. And whatever the two pizza team is doing behind that service interface, you don't need to care about, right? It's a black box.
Yeah. And
now all of a sudden you can scale without drowning in status meetings. So far, so good. So Amazon, in order to has this, thinks that to be productive, you want small teams, and now is organized itself internally to provide technology as a service. In order to scale organizationally. And they then had the unrelated but great insight that they could open these interfaces to the public. And that's AWS, right? I mean, I don't want to trivialize the fact that coming up with the insight that they could sell this to the public was like a big deal. Like that was a big deal, and that wasn't so much about the organizational structure. But having had the insight, the product was essentially already there. Yeah. They just had to do more of it. Now, that's all good, right? And if what you want to build is something like an AWS, fantastic. But maybe you don't want to build an AWS, right? Maybe what you want to build is an iPhone. Well, if you think about AWS, like there are many great things about AWS, but one of the things I would suggest it does not have is like a consistent UX.
Right.
It is a collection of services, each of which you can kind of interact with on their own terms. There are some commonalities. Yeah. But I think it's not a stretch to say that like there's no one at Amazon who's sort of thinking about the customer and what their consistent experience needs to be. Even if they were doing that, it's hard to understand how they would then implement that consistent experience across these sort of federated teams that are publishing these services. And if you're building AWS, that probably doesn't matter, right? But the iPhone is all about a very consistent user experience. And there, at Apple, they're organized very differently. They have teams that are structured much more hierarchically that can then filter up from functional units, software, hardware, etc., to a small number of folks at the top who can then sort of impart a editorial view about and curate, like what should the experience be. I don't think Apple's org structure would lend itself well to producing an AWS, and Apple did have some cloud efforts in sort of mid-aughts that they, I think, wisely eliminated fairly early on. And Amazon has made some attempts at like building phones, and that hasn't worked out all that well, right? Now, all these, there are many factors that determine outcomes of business, but I would suggest that Amazon's attempt to build a phone had with it headwinds as a result of their organizational structure, where AWS had massive tailwinds, right? And Apple just vice versa, right? Their ability to build the iPhone had huge tailwinds because of their org structure. And some of their cloud efforts maybe had headwinds for the same reason.
Absolutely. I mean, what I find fascinating, I mean, with Amazon, and I'll mention another company, is lending itself to their org chart, style. They also develop communication systems. So I know at Amazon, they're notorious. I think it's the first 20 minutes or half an hour of a meeting. You come in, you read, everybody reads the memo in silence, and only then you have then you start discussing it. So that's this kind of like repository, right? So the communication between all the two pie, pizza pie teams. Another company which I've heard has an incredible internal communication system is Stripe, who built their own kind of repository where they just want the information to be available for everybody to access, and then causing a lot less friction. So
there's this huge question and a lot of organizations have of like, how do we know what we know, right? Maybe the organization has institutional knowledge about X, Y, or Z thing, but any individual person within the organization, how do they access that knowledge, right? And that also is either is more of a problem or not, depending upon your organizational structure. If you can interact with lots of different sort of black box services, there's a lot you don't have to know. Right. On the other hand, if you need the sort of rich interaction, and the Amazon case is, again, a good one. So the memos that are read at the start of a meeting at the two-person team are incredibly rich artifacts of communication, right? The bandwidth, like Amazon's view is we need to communicate at such high bandwidth that talking is not sufficient. Like we need the written word, and we need to consume that communication at that high bandwidth, which is at the whole other end of the spectrum from interacting with like a black box service elsewhere in the organization, right? And what Conways Law says, right, just to expand upon it, another way to say it is the richness of communication that you can have within your organization will mirror the sort of richness of communication within your application, or the bandwidth that you're able to have of communication with the organization will determine the bandwidth of communication within your application. And intuitively, you can sort of recognize this, which is to say, if I'm building some software and some piece of it is dependent on someone else in the organization that I've never met, right? And in a totally different department. Yeah. Different location, different time zone, maybe, right? Like just as far away from me as possible. Then, we are both likely to agree, without even probably talking about it much, because again, our ability to converse is limited, that we're going to constrain the inputs I have to get from you and the outputs that I send back as tightly as possible, and we are forced to do that, right? Because the bandwidth that we have to communicate with each other is only sufficient to communicate a limited amount of set of like defined inputs and outputs. Right. So we have no other choice. If we try to fight that headwind, we'll be frustrated. It's not that it's impossible. People can do very interesting things, but that's a significant headwind, right? On the other hand, if I'm writing software, one function, and then the person right next to me is writing another function and they interact, we might have we might share memory, right? I mean, it might be such a rich interaction that it's not even correct to call it an API or something. And we can do that because we're sitting right next to each other. Our ability to communicate with each other, how our functions will interact, is not constrained by our own ability to communicate, right? So intuitively, like Conway's Law makes sense. I mean, how could it be otherwise, right?
Definitely.
Than this.
Yeah. So how early do you have to be intentional thinking about structuring your org? Is this when you're a 5-person team, 50, 5,000? Yeah.
So I think there's sort of a number of things to say about that. The first thing to say is, I don't think you can be too early in starting to think about this. Though I think there's a point at which this starts to bite. So I think one advantage that very early stage startups have is they don't face this trade-off. Because if you only are 8 people, then by definition your communication bandwidth is going to be pretty high, and so you don't face the trade-off because you don't have to deal with the issues of scaling the organization yet. And indeed, you also often don't have to think too hard about how to manage an organization of that size.
Mm-hmm.
And that issue of management, I think, is really where this comes home to roost. I'm a believer that people have an intuitive sense of how to operate in groups as a result of evolution and other sort of inherited factors, and that there are kind of imprecise breakpoints at which this breaks down. So there is some reasonable research that says, hunter-gatherers tend to be in groups with breakpoints of sort of 15, 50, and 250. And I think, in my experience, I do think those breakpoints are interesting ones. Below 15 people, you almost don't have to think about how to manage that group. Right. And as you hit those breakpoints, 15, 50, 250, that's often where you see sort of scaling friction start to come in, and you start to see org charts be created in some ways, or expanded. But they're created and expanded usually in order to facilitate the scaling of the organization, right? And some of that has to do with building great products, but some of it doesn't, right? And a lot of times people will say, well, should we organize ourselves into functional teams? Should we be interdisciplinary, right? And there are a bunch of different ways to think about that. To the extent you're building a software product, you want to think about, if I were architecting the internals of my products and thinking about all the different things I need to accomplish, if I have my product manager hat on, how would I organize my team? Because the choices you make in how to organize your team are going to constrain the ultimate choices that the product manager has. It's going to create these headwinds. This is what I mean when I say, amateurs talk about product, but professionals study org charts. A lot of the decisions that should be made with your product manager's hat on in terms of how to structure your product, structure your application, are in fact made when you structure your organization. And so if you do that without thinking intentionally about your product, that can lead to these significant headwinds and frustrations when you've built an organization that would give you huge tailwinds if you're building AWS, but you're actually trying to build an iPhone, or vice versa, right?
Don't you find
that's I think where the rubber hits the road, is you have this divergence of, I've got to put in an org chart, and you're thinking about lots of reasonable things to think about, but not product, and it has this huge impact on product.
Right. But isn't it usually that the product manager or owner wasn't the person, or isn't responsible with designing the org chart, and she or he is thrown into a situation and they need to communicate with 5 different functions, and which is causing them just not to perform, but they have no power to change
Absolutely.
things.
Not only do they have often no power to change things, they often are in good faith trying to apply their product manager toolkit to solve the situation. And what they need is like the organizational behavior toolkit to solve some of these problems. And maybe they brought that toolkit to work with them that day, or maybe they didn't. And even if they did, to your point, do they actually have the power in the organization to do anything with it, right? Sometimes you see in startups issues of organizations not scaling. And one of the sort of anti-patterns that you see is you see a CEO who's trying to transition from being the product leader to being the organization leader. And that's a natural transition, right, for CEOs to go through. And oftentimes, a lot of times CEOs find themselves stuck in that product lead role. And oftentimes it's not so much because the CEO is the only one who can be the keeper of the flame on the product vision, but because the CEO is the only one who has the power within the organization to make organizational changes that are required to make forward progress at all, right? Or even worse, because you don't identify this problem, the CEO is sucked into this conversation. the conversation is had, including the CEO, using sort of the product toolkit and not the org toolkit. And you end up not making progress. But so you get like the worst of all worlds. The CEO is sucked into something that they're trying to transition out of, but also you're not actually able to solve the problem.
Right. That's fascinating. Would you say there's a specific area within an organization that tends to be, that if not well managed, it's kind of the loss leader? I'm assuming like accounting. I mean, or like things that are rudimentary are kind of always replaceable. But is there anywhere in the core where it's a lot more sensitive?
I think there are a number of examples, but here's one. So there's oftentimes, for cultural reasons, low bandwidth communication between engineering and sales, for example, or sales and marketing, engineering and sales and marketing. To the extent that you need to build that cohesive user experience, customer experience.
Yeah.
If all the data on what the customers actually want is locked within sales and or marketing,
yeah,
and the bandwidth back to engineering is low from an organizational structuring perspective, like you shouldn't be surprised if it's hard for engineering to incorporate those learnings into the actual design of the product, because there's no, their ability to absorb the information is low, and therefore their ability to put that into practice is also low, right? That's a classic one, there are a variety of ways to deal with that. I mean, I think in some ways the Amazon two pizza team is also an attempt to deal with that issue, right? Because you have these cross-functional two pizza teams. But yeah, I mean, I think there's any number of them, but that's one you see.
Yeah, definitely. Is there an existing company or startup or even larger one that you see and think is a role model for innovation in thinking about the org structure and kind of pushing the boundaries on that?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's really hard for any organization to measure the impact of the things we're talking about right now, right? And so, these issues are necessarily, a little bit fuzzy, a little bit hard to reduce to hard numbers. And so it's easy, I think, for organizations to find it difficult to measure that. If something's difficult to measure, it's difficult to manage, right?
Sure.
And I think you see that. So, for example, Amazon's organization is awesome for AWS, right? Apple's is awesome for the iPhone. I am struggling at the moment to think of an organization that can, there's probably a good example, but I'm struggling to think of one. An organization that can deploy the right organization against a particular, against one product, and then a different organization type against a different one, right? What you tend to see is like organizational structures and the culture that goes along with them tend to make companies good at like the kind of product for which their organizational structure provides tailwinds and not for others. And because this is hard to measure and therefore hard to manage, it's very difficult for companies to switch from one to the other. That's what I would think would, if a company could do that, that's one where I think it would be, you'd see like, here's an organization that's really mastered this. I'm sure there are examples, though I suspect a lot of them are also somewhat unintentional, right? So you could have a company where one company acquires another, leaves the two different pre-existing organizational structures in place, and those two different org structures are good at different things. I'm sure occurs. And from an acquisition, from an M&A perspective, it's an interesting lens to use, right? Like, do we need to acquire a different organizational structure in order to be good at a different kind of product?
Right, another product line, that we can't execute well today.
Yeah, exactly. But do I have examples of companies that I know? I'm sure that some exist, but I'm not aware of companies that are operating at that level as we speak today.
It's probably something easier to see in hindsight and see something that I'm thinking. Currently we're in the pandemic. We're seeing a lot more teams adopting remote first approaches, and just thinking of products that require real, like a really experiential product. Kind of like an Apple. I don't know if it's a game or is it going to be harder for these companies to create with this kind of new type of MO of operating different locations, different time zones with these repositories, but not that next the fellow tap on my shoulder next door and hey, let's talk about this idea and that kind of thing.
Yep. So I think there's a big transition, right? I think a couple things. There's no question that companies have actually been more productive in the shift to remote work, and also it seems like most employees who've shifted to remote work are in favor of it. Certainly not all, but the preponderance of employees seem to be in favor of it. So I think whether it's good or bad, the shift to remote work, to the extent that companies are in a competitive labor market, I do think it's here to stay, right? So the question is, okay, how do we make best use of this kind of new normal? And I do think there are, putting my investor hat on for a moment, I think there is a tremendous amount of opportunity for companies to build tooling around increasing the bandwidth of communication between folks in the organization. Like sometimes you will have organizational structures like Amazon's 2 pizza teams that don't require a lot of bandwidth between them, and those are a natural fit for remote work. Sometimes you will have situations where the opposite is true, and that's where I think there's lots of opportunity to build new tooling. Any human's ability to communicate in terms of bits per second is at this point dwarfed by normal industrialized country like internet bandwidth. So I don't think this is a technical limitation in that sense. It's a limitation at the application layer, right? What tools can we bring to bear to make this communication as rich as it needs to be in those circumstances where the organizational structure requires it?
Right. Yeah. Well, this is definitely a fascinating topic, and we all have to be thinking as founders and operators deliberately and not really letting this happen, right? And then kind of trying to solve for the point problems instead of kind of the overlying structural or setting that's kind of tying our hands.
Yep. Yeah, I think to borrow another framework I'm fond of, if you think about any particular thing in your professional life is lying somewhere on two spectrums. You have the kind of important, unimportant spectrum, and then you have the urgent, non-urgent spectrum. These organizational structuring questions, when they are dealt with, are usually dealt with when they're in the quadrant of it's important and urgent, right? Like we have some kind of scaling thing we got to overcome, and we know how we structure organizations is important, and that's where we're going to deal with it. So we're going to, and usually what you find when things are in the important and urgent bucket is that we come to the solution that's best for right now, the right now solution. And these sorts of questions really should be dealt with when they're in the quadrant of important and not urgent.
Not urgent, yeah.
because that's when you can come up with the right solution as opposed to the right now solution, right? And that's easy to say. There's lots of different things that are competing to get into that, important and not urgent bucket, and lots of things that are in the important and urgent bucket that are crowding them out all the time. But if you're a founder, if you're a leader of an organization, that's what you need to do is think about these things, so that you don't paint yourself into a corner down the road, right? That's ultimately, I think, the take-home message here is that it's all too easy to find yourself painted into that corner.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully with these insights from you, founders and operators will definitely use this to build out their strategy when it's important and not urgent. So to wrap up, is there a favorite book or historical figure? I know you love history like me, that you look up to, that inspires you?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I'll try and give a couple. The one that comes to mind right now is actually an author. I've been doing some reading about the Reconstruction period in American history and Civil War. There's a fellow, Eric Foner, who's a professor at Columbia, who's written some great books about this period, and it's relevant to the business world only in the sense that all great history is relevant to the business world and to life in general. But I recommend his Eric Foner's work highly as something that I've been looking at. Just reading my personal life as something that I think people would enjoy if you're into history. So with regard to more of a business focus, boy, there's a lot of things to consider. But I think I would circle back to the one I mentioned before as something that I think is very relevant, the Mythical Man Month. And another classic that relates both to the Mythical Man Month, I think, and through that to the discussion we've been having today, is a book called The Goal, which is about operations management. It's mostly about how to manage manufacturing, but The Goal served as the inspiration for a lot of the work that went into Agile, which is the bloom has maybe come off that rose a little bit. But I think the underlying ideas in, for example, the Unicorn Project book and others are very interesting, and those stem from this book, The Goal. And that is a sort of foundational sort of classic in the field. I think is well worth considering, particularly for folks who are thinking about these organizational structure questions. I think it has a lot to be
absolutely
a lot to be learned from.
That's really great. I'm gonna link these books down here so people can check them out. And finally, where can people follow you?
So my blog is macdougherty.com. Dougherty is Dougherty. And I'm also on Twitter, Mac_Dougherty. So you can follow me there as well. And you can certainly find me on LinkedIn. You can find me by my name through my affiliate, my investment firm, Peak State, as well as the medical device AI startup that I am affiliated with, Argus Cognitive. So all good ways to find me on the interwebs.
Fantastic, Mac. This was an incredible, insightful conversation, and I look forward to applying some of the insights you shared here with us today.
Thank you. Me too. As always, it's easier said than done, but if you don't say it, it's hard to do it.
Exactly. Absolutely. Thank you, Mac.
All right. Thanks, Sean.